Well, tactically, the threat that by conservatives, by social conservatives, by the conservative movement, as they call themselves, based in Washington, based in places like Northern Virginia, to form a new party has always been this kind of bluff designed to bend the Republican Party to their will, and it's usually worked because the media reports it seriously, except for in the American context, third parties very rarely work. We have a winner-take-all system. So, the minute, say, Richard Viguerie, who threatens to create a third party, every 4 or 8 years because he claims that the conservatives in power aren't really conservative, if he really did it, he'd immediately be, surrendering all his influence in national discussions. So that's not really a serious threat. The division between, let's say, corporate conservatives and religious conservatives is, fascinating, interesting, rich, and complex. I mean, one of the ways it worked was that traditionally, basically one of the ways it evolved in the 1970s was that people who wanted, business who wanted more laissez-faire, less regulation, more control over government, more of, say, a cronyist stake in what government was actually doing, saw things like the Heritage Foundation, the Christian Coalition, the Moral Majority, as opportunities for them to form a coalition, if you give it a generous interpretation, or aggrandize their power, if you give it a little more cynical interpretation. So you get these fascinating movements like this war in West Virginia in 1974 by religious conservatives to kick heathen textbooks out of the schools that were sort of supposedly imposed by religious bureaucrats. It was a very local issue. It was a very localized struggle. It had a lot to do with the way politics works in West Virginia, where you have this kind of history of insurgent violence from coal miners. And you get these business conservatives in Washington at the Heritage Foundation realizing that this is an organizing opportunity for them. The Heritage Foundation sends representatives down to West Virginia and helps put these people in touch with national ideological entrepreneurs, with people like Richard Viguerie. And that's how a coalition forms that basically creates foot soldiers for an agenda that the West Virginia religious conservatives may or may not be supporting, but eventually they'll come to support. There's both an inherent tension and instability in it, but there's also within American Protestantism a real strain of pro-capitalism and individualism. So it's interesting, it's rich, it's tense. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And right now we're at a real knife's edge about whether it's going to work or whether it's going to fall apart. The CEO of, say, an aerospace corporation might not want to have anything to do with demonic possession, in Pentecostal churches. But he needs the people who have those great passions in order to kind of anchor the conservative coalition. So the question is, when have they created a Frankenstein's monster? When have they created something that they can't control? You're seeing more and more indications from conservatives of that kind of embarrassment. I was out the other night, and a West Point grad, a banker friend, who's a conservative, he called himself a country club conservative and said, "I have nothing to do with those Sarah Palin people." Well, the problem is, without those Sarah Palin people, the Republicans would never win an election. So, they find themselves on the horns of a dilemma. And the ideological entrepreneurs on the religious right who, let's face it, have an interest in aggrandizing their power and their control, don't really have any incentive to modify or moderate their positions. In fact, they're more likely to aggrandize their power and their influence by maintaining a front of purity. So that speaks to the whole tension and paradox behind the conservative project right now. All the people who've ascended to positions of power and leadership, and Rush Limbaugh is a perfect example, even though he pretty much unites the religious and the business conservatives pretty seamlessly, have achieved their influence, have achieved their power through a certain kind of cultural style based on their willingness to say that compromise is inherently bad. And that gets back to the question of whether Obama can, negotiate with people, the 20 million people who listen to Rush Limbaugh every day, and consider any compromise a betrayal of America's promise itself, right? So there's no incentive for a Rush Limbaugh to change, because this is what's given him this, these 20 million listeners, his mansion that has a replica of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. So when the Republican National Committee or a train of conservative Republicans who wish to moderate the image of their party to make it seem more centrist and palatable to swing voters, try and do that, Rush Limbaugh is able to not merely survive, but thrive by disdaining them. Healthcare is a fascinating example of this question of how religious conservatives and business conservatives can act in coalition. I'm being on the mailing list of the American Family Association, Don Wildman's organization. I'm beginning to get the emails saying that healthcare that basically a national healthcare program is imposition on Christians. It's going to fund abortions. It's going to violate the sanctity of the traditional family. So you see a pure example of kind of right-wing libertarian business conservatives using the leaders of the religious right in quite an effective way to undermine a mass constituency for a reform which in the end is actually quite conservative. I mean, what could be more what could be more judicious than, like I said, letting people change their jobs if they have an entrepreneurial idea? What could be more strengthening of the traditional bonds of family and society than families not going bankrupt because someone in the family gets sick? But there are very powerful interests who, basically benefit from the status quo. And they're able to take advantage of this pre-existing distrust that's very American of anything having to do with an expanding state. And again, historically, it's the same thing you saw with Social Security. It's the same thing you saw with Medicare. It's the same thing you saw with the idea that the United States in the 19th century should have a central bank. The same thing you saw when the government began talking about financing internal improvements like canals, the interstates, which were seen as a communist plot by some people. So the challenge for progressives, the challenge for people who believe that this is not only an important goal, but an imperative goal, national health care, is not to imagine that this kind of irrational fear is going to go away, but simply to bowl through it, force healthcare down people's throats, whether they like it or not, and watch what happens 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now when, again, conservatives come to power promising to uphold the ideals of Obama's healthcare program, just like George Bush promised to uphold Social Security and promised to honor FDR, and just like conservatives of every generation, or I should say reactionaries of every generation, say, well, the liberals that we're dealing with now are unacceptable extremists. The ones we had in the last generation weren't so bad.